So, speaking of ADHD, we're going to be talking about this from the lens of trauma because many people who have experienced complex trauma have been diagnosed with ADHD, or maybe you've self-diagnosed yourself and said, I think I'm one of these people who's suffering from ADHD. That the description really seems to fit me, and I think maybe this is a good description of what I'm experiencing in my life. We know Doug, his parents thought he couldn't get his life together, although he was in college. So he lived in his dorm room. Doug was always late on his getting his assignments done. Doug could barely pay attention in class. Doug had difficulty with his relationships because he had difficulty prioritizing things in his life. Doug experienced difficulty concentrating, not just in school, but when it came time now to get the schoolwork done at home. He felt it difficult to concentrate at home. And he was also experiencing difficulty controlling his emotions. And so Doug went and tried to get some help from a therapist, and the therapist diagnosed him with ADHD. And Doug found this diagnosis to be helpful. And he eventually got put on a medication that was supposed to help him to balance these symptoms that he was having of ADHD and help him to focus more. And at first, he was able to focus quite well on his schoolwork and able to focus better on getting his papers done and things like that. But I started to notice over time the drug that he was put on was habit forming. And so that made things a little bit tricky for him because he knew he was struggling with this ADHD, but he also felt like he didn't want to be dependent on this drug, which was actually, if he admits it, getting a little bit addictive. And it wasn't having the same potency that it used to have. So he found himself taking more and more of it. And typically, his experience is very similar for many who are suffering from ADHD. They may reach out for help. They may be diagnosed with ADHD based on their symptoms, and they may be put on a medication. And they may find the medication helps to a certain degree, but they may worry because what is the end game? Like, where are we going with this? Am I just going to have to be addicted or be on this, dependent on this drug in order to do anything in my life? Now, in Doug's case, he actually did have a story of childhood trauma that was not investigated by his therapist. So they were treating the symptoms, which seemed to be helpful for a while, but he never resolved his childhood trauma. And as a result, he found himself continuing to struggle with these same issues directly into his life later in adulthood. So ultimately, Doug realized he was going to need to resolve his childhood trauma, which raises a very good question. Is everyone who has ADHD also a survivor of childhood trauma? Is ADHD actually a set of trauma responses? Well, mental health professionals have found no particular definitive answer, but if you look at the symptoms of ADHD from the lens of understanding complex trauma, what is the conclusion that you come to? So some of the symptoms are poor planning, poor mood regulation, problems with task completion, poor time management, hyperactivity or impulsivity, difficulty focusing, low frustration tolerance, interrupted sleep, dissociation, disorganization, verbal communication problems, low self-esteem, forgetfulness, shame and guilt, sensitivity. Now, those were the symptoms, by the way, of ADHD, but you probably notice that they're the exact same symptoms of complex trauma. So if you're familiar with CPTSD, you're going to see those same symptoms, but you're going to see additional symptoms in CPTSD as well, which can take the diagnosis a little bit more extreme. But generally, you'll see a lot of overlap between ADHD symptoms and the symptoms of CPTSD. So what does this suggest? Well, we certainly can't say definitively that every person who has ADHD also had complex trauma or also had childhood trauma. We can't say that. But ADHD is typically diagnosed only if those same symptoms were experienced in childhood. What we can say for sure is that most who experience CPTSD also have qualifying markers of ADHD. So you're going to have the disorganization, dissociation, or the impulsivity, the mood regulation issues, the poor planning, the poor task completion. A lot of those symptoms are what you get diagnosed with later in adulthood, and they may diagnose you with generalized anxiety, generalized depression, personality disorder, and ultimately they may not pay attention to the fact that it's the same diagnosis that you would get, or very similar symptoms that would lead to a diagnosis of ADHD. So is ADHD a trauma response? Well, one of the main hallmarks of ADHD is dissociation. So that's viewed in ADHD as being inability to pay attention. But someone who has ADHD doesn't have an inability to pay attention. For instance, many times they have hyperfocus, which allows them to focus very closely on things that they are actually very interested in. So what they're saying is an inability to pay attention is ultimately a mild form of dissociation, which is where they are disconnecting from the reality around them. And how do they learn from such a young age to disconnect from the reality around them? How does a child learn to disconnect from the reality around them? Typically, it's because in their family of origin, there was unstable adults or an unstable environment. Adults may have been abusive. Adults may have been loud. Adults may have been neglectful. Or there's something unpleasant in that child's environment where the child learns that the best survival mechanism for himself or herself emotionally is to disconnect. And so they learn to retreat inwardly into themselves, and they may go into their imagination and daydream, or they may just blank out and seem to check out. I know as a kid, I was the number one daydreamer that I had ever heard of, because I could actually miss entire subjects. And if you remember, like in grade school, the teacher will change the subjects instead of you getting up to go to another class for each subject. So I would be sitting there, and I remember the teacher said, we're going to start spelling. And then something would happen, and we're all the way in social studies. And then the teacher's asking me a question, and I'm like, I got nothing. Like, I have absolutely no idea what we're even talking about. And sometimes a whole class would go by. So English would pass by, and I missed the entire class. So not just the lesson, but I missed the homework assignment and the lesson. And then so later, when my mom would be beating me, like, how come you didn't do your English? I literally had no answer. I didn't know the answer is because you beat me. You see, because the abuse is what leads to the dissociation. I wouldn't need to dissociate from my environment. I wouldn't have learned that in childhood if it wasn't a little unstable around here in my household, right? So what I learned as a trauma response, probably before I realized at 2 or 3 years old, became the way that I would associate with reality. So what happens is, and some of you can relate to this, and some of you are the opposite, but I suffer from hyper boredom. So situations tend to be too slow, too calm, too boring in normal everyday life. So if I'm sitting in a classroom and there's a teacher, it feels like the teacher is virtually speaking in slow motion. And then my mind just immediately, something she says or something someone else is doing, it's gone. My mind goes and it goes to a more comfortable place. And in that place, in my imagination, it's great. I'm building castles and I'm flying on the backs of fictional animals. It's a fantastic place in my imagination. So eventually the imagination becomes so comfortable that anytime I want to, I'm retreating back there. There's more dopamine release from my imagination than there is in listening to a teacher go on about a subject that I have no idea why she's talking about it or what's important about it. And that was my experience with ADHD, which may be different than some, but I was absolutely checked out. I was gone. Some people will describe relationships that they had where they were dating a person, but they were checked out the entire time of the relationship because of their ADHD, which again, they've learned to dissociate, often due to some type of childhood trauma. Now, of course, there's going to be the critics who say, hey, I didn't have any childhood trauma, but I still have ADHD. Now, to them, in my mind, I would say, I don't believe you. This is because I understand trauma, being an expert on it, and they may not understand really what trauma is. Trauma is so wide and so broad. It's difficult to say if you experienced a trauma when you were 2 years old or not. What is traumatic to a 2-year-old will not be traumatic to an adult. So you may look back at your childhood and say, I had a great childhood. It was great. I didn't have any trauma. But chances are you did experience some trauma as a 2-year-old or as a 3-year-old. Now, whether or not you learned maladaptive coping mechanisms or not, that would depend. But if you experience trauma or not, it may not be something you can remember. And many childhood trauma survivors truly have no idea that they actually were abused or neglected until they specifically learn about it through watching videos or by talking to an expert. And they say, oh, wow, really? I was abused. Like, I guess I never thought of that. One woman who was one of the very first CPTSD clients I ever had, when I retold her story of her childhood back to her, she said, I never thought of it as abuse. Even though Child Protective Services had visited her home before, she never saw it as abuse. So just because we may not remember abuse or we may not see our childhood as being traumatic to us, it doesn't mean that we may not have experienced abuse. It doesn't mean we may not have had some type of trauma, because there doesn't need to be abuse to have a trauma. It's not talking bad about your parents to say, I experienced childhood trauma. It's understanding the reality of a 2-year-old or of a 3-year-old. And so you may have developed dissociation and a list of other symptoms as a result of how you coped, because a 2-year-old can't escape the trauma. So a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old has to go inside of themselves. And so they go into a deep freeze, or it's like a flight into the self, which allows them to escape. So that's going into their imagination or blanking out so that they don't have to be present in an unpleasant reality. So if you feel like you have ADHD, or even if you feel like, hey, this is not really a thing, it's just a collection of symptoms that are basically trauma responses, however you look at it, in order to manage ADHD, if you'd like to do it without medication, you want to go to the specific symptoms that are causing a disruption in your life. You want to write them down on a piece of paper, and you want to come up with a game plan on how you're going to address those symptoms. You want to understand what this really comes down to and how you can address it. Because ultimately, it's learning to manage the symptoms that will be the cure of your diagnosis of ADHD. It's learning to manage the symptoms. A pill will not cure you of ADHD, period. There is no pill that will cure you of ADHD. You can take a pill that will help you manage symptoms. You can take a pill that will help you concentrate. For instance, Adderall. But caution is needed. Adderall is an amphetamine. which puts it in the same category as street methamphetamines, such as Molly, crystal meth, right? So you want to recognize this is not something you should lightly go on to just because it sounds cool or your doctor said, hey, try this. This is something you're going to need to really do the research on and decide if it's really right for you. Because many of my clients regret that they started taking it because now it becomes very difficult for them to stop. If you are using it, there's no shame in what you choose to use. I'm neutral when it comes to medications. But what I'm not neutral on is when it comes to healing. And if you want to overcome the diagnosis of ADHD, you have to manage the symptoms. You have to learn how to cope with the fact that you are different. Your brain operates differently. And so you're not going to exist in the world the exact same way someone who's not dopamine deficient exists in the world. Because to them, they feel like, hey, just sitting here in this classroom listening to a teacher teach, this is fun enough for me. That may not be how you feel as someone with ADHD. For you, you may need that more stimulation, but that comes off as impulsiveness and hyperactivity. But what you're doing to be impulsive is really you trying to fulfill this deprivation of dopamine that you feel, this need to have some sort of excitement, this need to feel alive. And that's created because you grew up in an environment where it was unstable like this. So then when someone gives you stability, you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. And you're suffering from boredom as a result. So what you want to do is go in and look at the individual symptom and look at how you can manage the symptom, right? So let's look at that because people who have ADHD have a superpower also. And I'll get to that. But let's look at these symptoms that are considered to be life disrupting. So poor planning is one of the symptoms. Now, understand that if you're a survivor of trauma, then your hippocampus has been damaged or is shrunken as a result of being in survival mode. The hippocampus is responsible for time management, planning, future, past, present, right? So we got to get the hippocampus pumped up and online. Your 30 minutes a day of exercise will allow you to give the gene, it releases the gene necessary to give you the fluffy hippocampus. So make sure you're hitting your 30 minutes a day of exercise. Learning planning skills and time management skills will help you to overcome the poor planning and the poor time management. Getting out of survival mode and getting into the prefrontal cortex, that is the conscious mind, will allow you to plan for the future and to manage your time. Giving up magical thinking such as, I'll leave 5 minutes before I'm supposed to be there and I'll get across town on public transportation that way. Well, no, that will come off as poor time management when you show up 45 minutes late. So understanding certain schemas need to change. No, you can't leave 5 minutes before. Take responsibility. What can you do? Well, you can change your schema to one that really works, such as there's no such thing as on time. There's late and there's early, but there is no on time. So what are you going to be? And if you're going to be early, then what time do you want to arrive? You don't want to arrive at 3 o'clock if it starts at 3 o'clock. You want to arrive at 2:55. That's the only way to be on time, is to be early. Even if it's 2:59, you have to be early, not on time. Now, when you're aiming to be on time, now you can start planning properly. But all of this takes place in the prefrontal cortex. That's the analytical mind. So we have to get out of survival mode and get into analyzing, into really thinking about things. And this is how we can overcome the poor planning. Someone with ADHD is not dumb. It's not that your brain doesn't work. It's that you're not using it in a way that's adaptive to this world and this society. Look, there's no time management and planning in the forest, in the wilderness, in a field. If we were living as hunters and gatherers, especially as a hunter, your ADHD mind would work just fine. because you will be in the grass waiting out the prey. As soon as they come, you're jumping out and you're hitting them with the arrows and doing whatever. It works for survival. It works for the wilderness. It doesn't work for this provincial city life that we live in here today. So if you want to get in and fit in with how society is working right now, you got to use special management skills, tasks to overcome these symptoms. So make it a game. Make it a game. Get out of the fear state and get into the dream state. When you're dreaming and focusing on your future, it makes it easier to plan. When you get out of the survival mode and you get into the love state, you start worrying about the well-being of other people, which makes it easier to manage your time. You can take responsibility. You are not impaired. You are not less intelligent. You can take responsibility and make it something that's important to you. Speaking of which, prioritization tends to be a symptom of ADHD, but it's also a symptom of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So the inability to prioritize comes down to not knowing what's truly important. This will help you in prioritization. Knowing your purpose in life and comparing every decision to how it bears into your purpose. Then you number 1, 2, 3, what's most important as to what bears into my purpose. We become confused when instead of focusing on our purpose, we're focusing on pleasing others. When you focus on pleasing others, you don't know what to prioritize, what's more important. It's because you may have had a domineering parent that made you focus on whatever it was to please them so that you could survive. And then you became a pro at pleasing everyone and not a pro at prioritizing for yourself. All of this happens in the analytical mind. The way you get out of survival mode into the analytical mind is pause, don't react, respond slowly. 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 7 before you make moves, before you make decisions, before you react. That allows you to get out of the survival mode and into your higher self, the conscious mind. Difficulty focusing. So you have to remember that your dissociation was a survival mechanism that you came up with in childhood. So if you want to be able to focus on something, if you want to be able to focus on a task, you're going to need to use certain tips and tricks to really finesse this. The number one thing is stop doing things that are so boring when possible. It may not work for you to be in school. So you may have gone to college or school because that was going to please mom and dad, but maybe that's not the place for you. Because if you have trouble focusing, maybe this is not where you need to be. Now, in some cases, we can't avoid that. Certain things require a certification or a class that we have to take. Where possible, can you take it online or can you record it? If you record the class, you can play it at a faster speed. Or if you read the book on audio, you can play it at a faster speed. Or if you get the YouTube video, you can play it at a faster speed. And it's easier to pay attention when the person's talking to you really rapidly like this, because your brain is not deficient. Your brain is just different. And you may need the information a little bit faster than everyone else needs the information. So this is a tool that I use. This is what helps me manage ADHD from being an impairment to a superpower. I don't show up to any class. No way I'm going to sit there and listen to someone talk. I'm going to put the recorder down and leave, have someone record it for me, or I'm going to get the YouTube, or I'm going to get the audio book. And then I crank up the speed to like 1.5 or 2. And I listen to that information upload into my brain rapidly, twice as fast, while I'm playing basketball at the gym. And that way, I'm able to actually take in the information. And then everyone says, man, you're so smart. How are you so smart? I have ADHD. Thank you. That's how I do it. I cannot sit and listen to someone speaking because it's too slow. I need it to come at me faster and stronger, unless they're a really talented speaker and they make it super interesting. That can work if they're very engaging. But the average teacher is not going to be able to hold the ADHD brain. So I manage it. I find a way around it. Get creative, find ways around the very thing that holds you back, and it will become a superpower for you. Now, because I'm able to read books so fast, because I'm taking them in 2 times, I'm uploading them like I'm in the Matrix, the knowledge level is on 100. But it's because of the ADHD that I learn how to get around it, and I learn a superpower. So take the very thing that's a symptom, something that's holding you back, and start figuring out a bridge around it. Creativity is another hallmark of someone who has ADHD. Many people with ADHD are also deal with mood regulation issues, but mood regulation issues all are being in that hippocampus, the limbic brain, the animal brain. We got to pause 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Allow the prefrontal cortex to fire up. Make all decisions here. I will not respond to you. I will not answer any questions until 7 seconds has passed. I'm sorry, this is just too important. And you wait. And you make everyone around you wait. 7 seconds. It's not that long. But if you just pause and realize this is not a survival situation, so there's no reason for us to use our survival brain. We need to be 80% in our prefrontal cortex. That's analytical, that's wisdom, that's thinking, that's weighing things out, that's making decisions. That is the higher self. That's the wiser self. That's the father mind, that's the mother mind, that's the godlike mind. That's where you want to be. It's our consciousness, is our gift as humans that makes us different from all the animals on earth. We are superior because of our consciousness. Use it. Get out of the survival mind by pausing. Rule of 7 seconds. And again, you want to create games for yourself. If there's verbal communication problems, you may notice that your verbal communication problems come from being interrupted as a child, or having pressure put on you as a child, where if you didn't speak up or say something a certain way, you were going to get hit or slapped, or there's going to be some consequences for what you said or how you said it. Your verbal communication problems stem from your childhood, but they get diagnosed. So there's a part of ADD. Sorry, you have verbal communication problems. Well, even Adderall is not going to help us to suddenly be an eloquent speaker. What do we need to do? We have to slow down when we're talking. Think first. How long should you think before you say something? 5 to 7 seconds. Rule of 7 seconds. If you think, it will allow you to make the statement so much better. You can be concise and make your point. So now you bring in prioritization. I'm going to prioritize exactly what it is you need to hear. And then I'm going to bring in my rule of 7 seconds and take my time, and I'm going to put it together. And I'm going to be eloquent in the way I put my words together so you understand exactly what I'm saying. I'm going to get straight to the point. I'm going to give it to you in a proverb. That is how you overcome your verbal communication problems. It takes practice, but most of all, self-control. That's the pause. Don't react. Respond. Take your time. Think about it. Let the person sit there. Yes, it may be awkward for a moment, but take a moment and think about how you want to respond. And the person may say, "What is taking so long? Why don't you just respond?" Don't let them draw you into their game. That's how you got these symptoms in the first place. By being pressured to always immediately please everyone, that's over. No more people pleasing. Don't please anyone. Disappoint everybody by taking your time and answering right here. Because in the end, you're going to be pleased. So instead of being a people people pleaser, become a people disappointer. Become a people displeaser. Own it and enjoy it. Because the fallacy of the people pleaser is this idea that they can please everyone. You can't. That's a false belief. You cannot please everyone. Stop trying. There is no Name one famous, successful person who everyone loves. And we'll be here all day because everyone's got haters. And the more well-known they are, the more people hate them. The more that know you, the more will hate you. So don't worry about it. Don't try to get everyone to like you. That doesn't exist. Be true to you. You have your values, your purpose in life. That's what you have to focus on. That's who you need to be. So focus in on what you're here to accomplish, what you are going to do. Pause 7 seconds, get into your frame, and give the world a little piece of you. And you will change the world with your words, with your actions. And that's what we really need. We need a little bit more of you, not you to be pleasing everyone else. We need more of you. Whether the world's ready for it or not, like it or not, we need you. You are a snowflake. There's none other like you. There has never been anyone else like you. There will never be anyone else exactly the same as you. There is only one you, and you are right here in this moment, in this unique time and place to do something amazing. Don't allow society to put you in a box and say, well, too bad, you're on ADD. Here you go. Take your medications. You take control of who you want to be. You get past the impulsiveness, the hyperactivity by pausing, allowing the prefrontal cortex to fire up, getting into that wise mind and making your decisions. I want you to flip the way you look at your diagnosis. I want you to flip it as I have a superpower. I have an edge up on everyone else. They're the 80%. I'm the select 20%. And only us select 20% of people on earth can learn all the really cool tricks and tips on how to show up to life and be just mind-blowing. Because all of your favorite artists and musicians, almost all of them, also would get a diagnosis of ADD. And they've had trauma. There's not a lot of really great music that's coming out of non-trauma situations. Okay, so what they did was they took what was bad and they found a way to flip it into something that's good. You could say they made lemonade out of their lemons. I'm not saying that what's happened to you in your past was good. It wasn't. But you can make lemonade out of your lemons. You can turn around and say, you know what? I'm going to flip this because me being the way I am, I'm especially good at figuring things out. So those of us, because of the ADHD, we weren't ever paying attention. So we had to figure things out. So you may have developed that skill. That's a superpower, your ability to figure things out. Those of us who had ADHD, we may have had low self-esteem growing up, but that gives you humility. Humility is a superpower that allows you to be approachable to any person on earth. Everyone loves talking to and being around someone who has humility. Instead of looking at it as, okay, well, I'm just a forgetful person. No. You remember the things that are important to you. You remember things. We have to learn workarounds for forgetfulness. We have to learn workarounds for forgetfulness. So what do? Find a way around it. Instead of allowing people to ask me directly for a session, I say, here, use this link and schedule it on the calendar. So then they go right in on the automatic calendar. So I would forget. If you just said, hey, are we doing a session on Saturday? I will definitely forget. But if you put it in on the automatic calendar, we've got a workaround. Then it almost looks like a superpower. It actually ends up working for me because all of the appointments are organized. I'm able to get several appointments in a day. It's like, man, how do you do it? Don't you get tired of working with people? No, because I don't have all of these appointments in my brain. I have no idea how many appointments I have tomorrow. And I won't know till tomorrow when I wake up and look at my calendar. So I'm not fatigued because I'm not constantly thinking of it. It becomes a superpower. One of the best superpowers that comes out of ADHD is the ironic one, which is hyperfocus. Someone who has ADHD has the ability to focus in on something that they are really interested in, and they will not even get up to use the bathroom. They are so focused on it. So when you really get on your task, when you really get in that creative space, when you're really into it, you will be going, and you won't even remember to eat because you're so focused. But remember, this can be a superpower. Your hyperfocus can allow you to focus and do something until you gain mastery. So pick something and you will develop a talent very quickly because of your ADD. It'll take someone else months, years to learn it. It'll take you weeks, and you will develop a talent. You will develop an ability. Why? Hyperfocus. You will learn how to do all kinds of things very quickly. We live in a time where information is extremely accessible to us. Anything you want to learn how to do, not only can you get a book on it, you can get a free YouTube video on anything you want to learn. I was just telling someone today, I decided that I was going to do a car flipping business once because I saw it online. So I hyper-focused on learning how to flip cars. I started buying cars. I had a car. It needed the catalytic converter replaced. Now, I didn't want to take it in to get the catalytic converter fixed because that would cost me money, and this was an investment. So do you know, with no mechanical experience and absolutely zero interest in cars my entire life, I was a theater kid. I hated cars. Zero interest in cars. I replaced that catalytic converter on my own. How did I do it? I went on YouTube, found a video showing me how to replace that exact part on that exact car, because that is how plentiful knowledge is right now. I watched the video, I put it down right there as I was under the car, look at the video, do the task, look at the video, do the task. I replaced the catalytic converter in a car. And I've never fixed anything on a car before. It's all right there. The information, the knowledge is at our fingertips. Get out of the mindset of I can't because I have ADD, and start realizing you can, when you do something, it's going to be above and beyond what anyone else is able to do. And then you're going to get bored with it and move on. Because you better believe I don't continue to fix cars because I'm just not interested, but not because I can't. I've already proved what I could do. If I wanted, I could open up a whole catalytic converter business, but I just didn't want to. So I moved on. I've made thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on businesses that I started that I learned how to do the task from watching YouTube. One of those was television mounting. I had no idea how to mount a television. I was coming back from the jungle of Guyana and I had absolutely $0. I was like, how am I going to make money? I know. I'm going to use my ADD superpower, and that's going to catapult me. So I use my ADD superpower and I start scanning through YouTube on how to do this task that I saw a lot of people were interested in hiring someone for. It was mounting TVs. At that time period, flat screen TVs are flying off the shelf. I got in there and I watched the video on how to do it. I started showing up at people's houses and mounting their televisions. I couldn't even afford the drill. I was renting it from Home Depot. Turned it into a six-figure business. How are we doing this? ADD. It's a superpower. When you learn those workarounds, it's a superpower. If you feel like you can't remember things, use a workaround. Use computers and lists. It's the workarounds. You have super gifts. Focus on your gifts. Focus on what you have, not what you don't have. That's what Michael Jordan did. And yes, Michael Jordan has ADHD. And so he hyper-focused on learning how to do his dribbling and his shooting. He took it right to the top. So you be the Michael Jordan of your field. And then when you conquer that field, toss it aside and go do another thing. And do it again and again and again. Attain to the greatness that is your potential, which is unlimited.